All right, Deuteronomy 14. Let's call this one Rejoice Part 2. I try not to repeat titles too much without giving a good subtitle, but if we had to subtitle this one, let's subtitle it Don't Worry. Why? Because after the first 21 or so verses that talk about clean and unclean foods, similar to the way that Leviticus 11 talked about clean and unclean foods, one of the distinctions here seems to clarify even more that the thing that bound together a lot of the unclean animals, especially the land animals and the birds, was the ones that were off limits were typically those that dealt in death, whether in the air, vultures or birds of prey, or on the ground, likewise predators. And so that might not be a strict rule, especially for the fish, but it seems to be pretty consistent, especially when we look at the special consideration that was given to those who had been in contact with dead bodies, animals, insofar as they were not killed specifically for food. Soldiers, even though they went to war to presumably do some killing, had to endure a period of cleansing. And then the red heifer sacrifice was a sacrifice to cleanse the people from coming in contact with death. Likewise, we looked at David being a man of blood, and that being the reason why God said, look, Solomon's going to be the one to build the temple, not you, even though David was a man after God's own heart. So the predator distinction in terms of the predators typically being off limits in terms of air and land animals that they could not eat might be a stretch, but it might not be, because it comes in a consistent pattern of things that were defiled by death. Either way, that ties into the second half of the chapter, which talks about, again, the places in which they can eat their celebratory offerings. And an additional fact that he's going to add here is the fact that if it's too much for them to carry the tithe, which he's going to discuss in the second half of the chapter, to the designated place, he is giving them an opportunity to convert it to money and simply buy the things they need there. But the reason why I thought Rejoice was a good title to repeat here was because I had a shift in perspective, and instead of looking at the need to go to the designated place as an inconvenience, I started realizing, wait a minute, the only reason you have to be inconvenienced by carrying things to the designated place is because you got stuff to begin with. And part of the occasion here was to make sure that those who didn't have were provided for, and they wouldn't have a whole lot to carry, but they did have this added advantage. And if we look at the tithe that was to be accumulated at the end of 3 years, we can possibly see that where it reads in verse 28, at the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow who are within your towns, shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. And the thing that I thought about this time is it seems to be an occasional inconvenience to those who have, to provide an occasional convenience to those who don't have, understanding that they would spend most of their lives sometimes, especially if they were poor and maybe destitute, trying to figure out how to make ends meet from day to day. And this was the one time when they could rely on being welcomed instead of having to possibly deal with the awkward or embarrassing situation of having to ask for help. And so in inconveniencing those who had enough to share, one, God is making it a little bit more convenient for them to go to the designated place where those who from day to day struggle might have a little bit of relief from the shame of having to have everybody know that they were a little bit short. And so with that, as we are looking at a concept called hospitality in the New Testament, part of hospitality is not simply providing for people or inviting people in our homes. Strong's definition of hospitality, as I heard a brother preach, or really two brothers preach in about the last month, is quite simply, as Strong's defines it, as philoxenos, hospitable, loving strangers, a friend of or kind to strangers. And part of being kind to strangers or loving strangers is not just giving them stuff, but it may be allowing them to feel welcomed and as if they're not being an actual burden. And that's what this occasion in Israel seems to be. And likewise for us, when we are looking at the call to be hospitable or kind to strangers, loving them probably involves more than just giving them stuff, but actually relieving the anxiety that can come with needing it in the first place.